Hey everyone, this is Tuan Nguyen again. I'm going to walk you through the Attended Framework 2.0 deep dive. So this session is more made for technical audiences, RPA developers, COE leads. We're going to dive into the framework and show you exactly what's happening underneath the hood. So hopefully you looked at the runtime experience video already and you've gotten some flavors of how this framework can really enrich the end user experience. So a quick recap. At runtime, you're going to get this form that's displayed to the end user. It's going to give them an overview of the automation, collect inputs from them, and then it will actually save those inputs and pre-populate them on the next run. During the execution, they're also going to have this status window in the upper left-hand corner, which you can use to update messages and send prompts to the end user. Lastly, at the very end, after a transaction has executed, you're going to get a results form. In the results form, depending on whether or not it's successful or an error has occurred, one of these forms will appear, providing additional options for the end user. And then, of course, the end user will have the ability to hide any one of these forms or messages via the assistant. And if they run this automation through pip, these forms and messages will still show up in the main session, but the logic or the process itself will run in pip. So with that covered, the user flow will follow accordingly. The user will access the automation through the assistant. They'll select whether they want to run in pip. And then once the automation starts, what the automation does actually is it reads in a config file that's stored locally in the My Documents folder. Now, this is a text-based config file that we save after each successful execution, and that's basically used to instantiate the config dictionary. And so that's how we can pre-populate the input form at runtime with the previous selections. Once a user provides their inputs and they press a button, then it's going to go ahead and kick off whatever process is associated with that button. The process can update the config dictionary during its duration, all the while sending messages to the end user via the status window. Now, once that process is finished, it can return execution to the input form and update the input form as well. If you're pressing a submit button, then after the process finishes, it will go to the result form. If it is successful, you'll get a successful results form. And then if the user closes the process, then it will go ahead and overwrite that local config file so it can be used during the next time the automation is ran. The user can also press repeat process from the final form, which will bring it back to the input form. So this way, we provide the end user the ability to jump in and out of the automation or repeat the automation without having to restart it all from scratch. And then, of course, they have the options in the assistant to hide any one of these elements. So what we want to focus on during this session is really what the developer experience overall looks like. We wanted to make sure that the attended framework provided a lot of value without a substantial amount of learning or investment into the framework. And so we really focused on keying in on how you could utilize all the functionality that you see previously without having to fill out a bunch of XAMLs or understanding really complicated things that are going underneath the hood. So if you have a really simple linear process with just one button in your form, then all you'll need to do is edit just these 4 XAMLs and your config file that's in Excel. So I had mentioned that at runtime, we do use a text-based config file. That is true, but at development time, you can go ahead and continue using your Excel-based config file. And then at runtime, the automation will actually convert that Excel file into the text-based config file. Now, what you're going to need to do is go into your main, just make sure everything's looking good there. Go into the display input form, and then you're just going ahead and provide all of the components that are necessary to collect the inputs from your end user. So text boxes, folder browses, everything that you would necessarily get from your attended user so that they can use those inputs throughout the automation. And it's important here that you just note down what the field key is, because that's how you're going to reference those values later on. Next, you're going to go to the form button action XAML. So this is really important. If you have multiple buttons on your form, then the automation needs to know which process it should execute. So the form button action is actually a switch statement, and the switch case correlates to the field key of the button. So it can determine, based upon the button, which process to invoke. And then last but not least is the process.xaml, which is the logic of your automation. So ideally what you would have here is if you had multiple buttons, you would just have a folder for each button, and then you could just group all of those XAMLs that are related to each other within the button, and that will help you categorize and structure your automation very efficiently and easy to understand. And the config file is not substantially different from what you've used for the RE framework, so very easy to understand as well. Now we looked at familiarity, and so we continue to use state machines in the main.xaml. You'll see that we modified it just a bit from the RE framework. In the initialization config, all we're doing is initializing the config from that local text-based config file. There's no applications that are opening at this point. Once that's successfully done, we're going to display the input form that you had specified in display input form. And we're going to collect the inputs from the end user, and then when they click the button, it's going to go into form button action. It's going to go into the switch statement and determine what button was clicked and to invoke that proper process associated to the button. It's going to go ahead and do that, perform the process, and then when it returns execution, it will go ahead and go into the results form. Based upon whether it is successful or error, it will display the requisite form. And then once the user chooses their options, whether they want to repeat the automation, email an error, or even view the outputs, they can do so. And then when they close the automation will end with the end process state. Last but not least, we wanted to make sure that the Attend framework was accommodating for all types of use cases. For those of you that use the RE framework, you can actually embed the RE framework into the Attended framework as one of the buttons. And so the Attended framework is really flexible in that you can have one button that just executes a simple sequence, another button that executes a flowchart, and then even a button that executes something complex like the RE framework. And so we really wanted to make sure that that was accommodating for your use cases. And we've actually included a set of workflows so that if you wanted to look at how the RE framework was utilized, you could do so there. And there are just some quick modifications. Really, it comes down to how we've modified the initialization state within the RE framework. You'll see here that it's start up application instead of initialize. Because we've already initialized our config, you won't do anything in this step aside from just closing and starting up your applications. So let's look at the execution flow. We went through it just a little bit already. But you'll see here, we have our initialization state in our main. In the initialization state, if an error occurs, we will go straight down to results form. Likewise, with anything that is error related in the display form or any of the processes, we will go straight to the result form and display an error result form. Now, if this is successful, we will display our form to the end user. The user will click a button, and then it will perform the requisite process association with that button. So as you can see here, as I mentioned before, you can have a sequence, you can have a framework, you can have a flowchart, anything that you'd really want. The user interface portion is really agnostic from the process itself. And then from the result form, of course, you can repeat the automation. And this also allows you to repeat the automation if an error occurs, as long as the error did not occur in the initialization state. The reason why we didn't provide a button for repeating a process from the initialization state is because if an error occurred during the initialization of the config, the end user is not going to probably have much options to really remediate that. And so we went ahead and just told them to end the process, and they can email that error to their support team. So let's take a look at what it looks like if you were to map a button to the RE framework. So it's just a quick RE framework example. As you can see, if one of my buttons was mapped and the process associated with that button was the RE framework, we would go ahead and use this process overview XAML that we provided, which goes ahead and executes along your typical RE framework flow. All right, last but not least, I wanted to show you something. This is a little bit on the more complex side, but as I mentioned, the config file, the local text file that the automation is reading from at runtime is stored locally in your My Documents folder. Now, the first time that you run this automation, that folder is not going to exist. So what the automation does in the initialization state, or the framework, as I should say, is it actually goes in and it checks to make sure those folders exist, and it checks to see, does this text-based configuration file exist? And so let me show you what it looks like on my computer. So here is my documents folder. There is a master's config folder called UiPath configs. Do not delete. As creative as I could be, this is the best that I could come up with. And inside that folder, you're going to have a number of folders for each automation that is built using the Attended Framework. And within there, you're going to have this run config.txt. That's actually what's read in during runtime to instantiate your config dictionary. So this is created at runtime from your Excel file. And as you can see, all these folders up until this point may not exist the first time you run this automation. So basically what the automation is doing is that it's getting your project name and version, and it's checking, does this run config.txt exist for your particular project? If it does, let's go ahead and initialize it. And then what we're going to do is just update that config with some values from your Excel config file. Not the entire Excel config file, just the form defaults tab. And I'll explain why that's important in just a bit. Otherwise, if this folder doesn't exist, or if this file doesn't exist, what we're going to do is go through a series of steps where we check to see if those folders exist. And if they don't, we're going to go ahead and create those folders. And then we're going to instantiate a brand new config file. And then we're going to basically update that config file with all the values from our Excel config file. And so when we read it in, now you're going to have a config dictionary that's been updated from all the values with your Excel config file. Okay, so that will make a little bit more sense once I dive into the Excel config file. But let's go ahead and take a look at the Attended Framework in Studio. All right, so really quickly, taking a look at that config file so we don't lose that thought. The config file is modified slightly for the Attended Framework from the RE framework. In here, we have our form defaults tab. From in here, you would put your field keys from the form components and then the value that you want them to reset. So as I mentioned, with the Attended Framework, every time you run an automation successfully, it's going to save your inputs and store it to that local run config.txt file. And then the next time you run the automation, your automation will go ahead and take this run config.txt, and it's going to create a config dictionary with it, and then it's going to push all that data into your user input form. Now, there might be times when you know your end user will need to, let's say, reset certain fields or want to reset certain fields, or maybe you just don't want them to be saved. Well, what you would do here is you would provide the field key for that form component and then the value, and then every time they run that automation, basically these values are updated into your config file. So it will basically reset your form components with the values you have here for those field keys. Okay. Next, we have an exceptions tab. So here you can specify the field key in your configuration file for certain exceptions that are business rule exceptions, and then the value that you want to appear. So why we use this is that it allows you to not hard code business rule exceptions into your workflow itself. Let's say if you have some kind of exception message that's going to display to an end user due to user errors, that user might come back and say, the error message that you have placed there or displayed to me isn't very useful or it's very vague. So instead of going into the code and changing some static text, you can go in here, change the text here, and then it will propagate throughout your automation. Next, we have a settings tab. So this tab is fairly important. You're going to provide your automation name here, and this is going to propagate and update in your forms within the automation, along with the user guide and the automation description. So you don't actually have to do these in the form itself. You put them in the config Excel file here, and then it will update in your automation at runtime. The error email recipient. So you might have noticed in the previous runtime experience video that if you provide an error email recipient here, when that error email is drafted, it will populate with whatever email address you put here. Okay, and if you're using orchestrators in your process using the RE framework, then here's your orchestrator queue name and folder. Last but not least are just some of our constants. If you want to change the title of the UiPath forms at runtime, you can go ahead and do so here. Here you can change your max retries, etc. if you're using the RE framework. Here is a tab for assets. And last but not least, here's a config reference tab. So this isn't actually utilized in the automation. This is purely for your own reference. We've aggregated all the keys that we use in the config dictionary throughout the automation. These are all the default ones that we created. It lists what the key is, where it's initialized, where it's used, and the description of that key. So hopefully this is helpful when you're trying to determine, why are we using a key somewhere in the workflow. You can reference this file, and hopefully it will help you. Down here, I've added my own. So all the ready to go automations, we'll go through and we'll add any field keys that we've created in the user input form, as well as any exceptions. All right. So with that said, let's take a look really quickly at the workflow itself. So you'll see here, this is the take a screenshot example that I showed in the previous runtime experience. First and foremost, we've created a parallel at the top level with the main process, as well as this additional sequence. You can see here this sequence includes the show status window workflow. If I open this up, this is actually rendering that status window at runtime. We've used an invoke code activity to render a WinForms window. And then we basically use a trigger scope that's continually waiting using an IPC receiver trigger. And that channel is status window, and it's listening for basically updates to that status window. And so when it receives an update, and I'll show you what activity that is, it will go ahead and update the label that is being used in this status window. So that's basically why we put it into a parallel, because we needed something to start at the same time as the main workflow, but also continually listen. And so that's why we have this trigger scope. All right, so diving in, as I mentioned, in the initialization config state, you're just going to go ahead and go in and load in that config file. And so here we init all settings. It's going to go down here and check and get config. So this is the large workflow that's going to basically check to see if your config, your runconfig.txt file exists in that My Documents folder. Okay, if it doesn't, it's going to go through and create those folders as well as initialize that config dictionary. And then based upon whether you are running your automation from Studio, if you're running it from Studio, then your config dictionary will be updated with all sheets from your Excel config file. If you are running it from the assistant and the version has not changed from the previous version of the previous execution, then what it's going to do is just update the form defaults. But if you are running it from the assistant and it's a new version, meaning that you published a new version since the last execution, then it's going to go in and it's going to update that config dictionary with all sheets from the Excel file. Why do we do that? Is because for performance. We don't want to read in all the sheets if we don't need to, because nothing else has changed. All we really want to do is update those form defaults. So that's why you see this complex logic being utilized to update our config dictionary at runtime. So once that config dictionary is initialized, it's going to return control. What it'll also do here is it'll actually create a separate text-based config file for your assets. And in this init all settings, we're actually checking to see if that asset config.txt exists. If it does, we're going to go ahead and read it in, and then we're going to go ahead and store those updated asset values in your config dictionary. Okay. So once that's done, we're going to take that config dictionary that's now been initialized with hopefully your last execution. Then we're going to assign some defaults. We are going to assign a default result form message. So the result form message is a string value that we're going to use when a successful execution occurs in the final result form. Okay, we just reset it so that if you're repeating the automation, you don't get a bunch of duplicate values. Next, we check to see if the automation was started in pip. This is really important because this is how we determine whether or not we should run the logic of the automation in pip. We're going to store it in a flag within the config dictionary. Next, we're going to just set some defaults again. Form cancel, we set false. For showing the view output, we set as false. So show view output is a Boolean value. It's either true or false. This is going to determine in your successful result form whether or not that button that says view output will appear. By default, we set it as false. So in your process, if you have, let's say, an output folder that you generate deliverables or outputs in, then you would go ahead and set this to true. Next, we have a show repeat process. So once again, there is a button in both the success and the error result form that says repeat process. So it allows the user to click the button and it's going to go back to your user inputs form. This is set to true by default. The only time that it's set to false is when you have a system exception that occurs in the initialization state. Next is our repeat process. We set this to false so that you're not stuck in an infinite loop, even though you want to cancel. And then last but not least, we set a key to status window channel. So this string right here correlates to, remember, that status window channel that we had. And so anytime that you want to send updates to your status window, you're going to have to use this channel. And so we just store it in the config dictionary so we don't have to continually write it over and over again. All right, and so once that's been initialized and the defaults have been set, we're going to go down into your user inputs form. We minimize the UiPath assistant, and then we determine, has the end user selected to hide the input form? If they have, then we probably won't display the input form. We'll basically just jump straight into the process. But there's one other caveat. Basically, we have a hidden row in our Excel config with the value first run. That's always going to be set to true for the very first version of your automation and every new version after that. Why do we do that? It's because we don't want the end user to accidentally select hide input forms during their first run and then basically not able to provide any inputs into the automation. Basically, it would always error out. And so if it's the first time the end user has ran the automation or it's the first time during a new version, the user input form will always appear. And then after that, they can hide it. And so this is a check there that we set. And after the first successful execution on a new version, we set this first run value to false. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at if the user showed the input form. We're going to go in here. The input form will appear, and I'll explain what these assignments mean in just a bit. So for the input form, you would just need to go in, and you just need to drop in any of your inputs components in between the view user guide and above this table component here. So as you can see here, here's all of the input components that I use for take a screenshot. You don't need to mess with the user guide. You don't need to mess with any of these other components that are not populated right now because they're populated at runtime. And then of course you would just add additional buttons, make sure you remember the field key, the submit button, field key is submit. The cancel button is already taken care of. You don't need to do anything there. All right. So the thing about forms that makes it a little bit tricky sometimes, or a little bit tedious, I would say, is that there's two ways that you can get and push and pull data from the form. One is the form field's input data, which pushes data into the automation via JSON. And then also the form field's output data, which pulls data out of the form using JSON. We used to use this method, but we noticed that you couldn't create real-time forms, meaning that if I had something that was returning data back to the form and I wanted the data to refresh in the form, you can't do that with these two options. You usually had to actually use these data bindings. So you'd have to actually create a field key for each of your components that you wanted to refresh and then map it to a variable. It's really tedious. And what we learned is that you don't actually have to do that. You can just put all of your form components into a container. So let me show you that one more time. So here you can see there's a container. We put everything inside the container. And then we just pass in our config dictionary as an object into that container, and then it will just pre-populate any field key values that match up with any of your components' field keys. We leave this automation name, logf business process name, outside of it, just for formatting purposes. It gets a little funky inside a container, so we left it outside. But basically, that's why we're assigning our config dictionary to this container object so that we can pass it in and out. All right. So once the user provides their inputs, click submit or whatever button that they press, we're going to take that container object again, and we're going to deserialize it back into our config dictionary. So now remember, this is now an updated config dictionary with all the values that the user had provided through the form. And we're going to take the button the user selected and also store it inside our config dictionary. And then based upon the button, we're going to perform a few different things. We can cancel the automation. So if we cancel it, we're just going to set form canceled in the config dictionary to true, and that's going to help us dictate where we should go when we're back in the main workflow. Or we can open the user guide. So if we open the user guide and you as a developer have provided an URL link in the Excel config file, then it's going to go ahead and try to do that. If it doesn't, we're just going to broadcast a message to our status window that says user guide was not provided. Okay. All right. So what happens if we ask you to press a button that actually has a process associated with it? Then we'll go down this default case. And this is why it was important for us to determine whether or not the automation was started in pip. If the automation was started in pip, what we're going to do is we're going to invoke this form button action XAML inside picture-in-picture. Otherwise, since we're not in pip, we're going to invoke it in the current session, which is the main session. All right. And so if I go into here really quick, we'll come back to this. We're going to go ahead and broadcast a message that the process has started. So as you can see, this is really how you actually update the status window in the upper left-hand corner. You're going to use a broadcast message activity. It's inside the IPC activities package. And then what you need to do is make sure that you provide a channel that is listening for these messages. So remember when I was back in the main workflow, we set some defaults right after we initialized the config. And one of those defaults was the status window channel, which was status window. Okay, and that is the channel that's listening for your status message updates. So we're going to send this message to this channel. It's listening and waiting so that we can update our status message or status window. And the message here is going to be process started. So now we go down into the switch case. So as you can see here, I'm looking at the button that was selected in the form, and then I'm going to perform the process that is associated with that button. Because this automation only has one button, I only have one case, which is submit. But you can see that if I had multiple buttons, like get emails or draft templates, I could just add additional cases here, which would correlate to the field key of that button, and then I can invoke different processes. And this is really where you would start invoking your sequences, or your flowcharts, or your RE frameworks. This serves as kind of the traffic cop to determine what process you should execute. Okay, and so because I only have one submit button, here's a simple process.xaml. If you open it up, you'll see that this is just a really simple sequence that I put together for this automation. As I mentioned, the result form message key is what will appear in your success result form at the end of the automation. And so you can use this to just concatenate whatever message you want to display to the end user if they have a successful execution. All right, and so here you can see I'm just performing some actions with some try catches. And you'll see that I continue to concatenate this message based upon the operations that the user performs or has selected. And so if they selected to save this file locally, then I'm going to concatenate that the image was saved to whatever the output folder was. If they sent the email, I would concatenate as well, right, to say that an email was sent. And then at the very end, I'm concatenating just to let them know that the snippet was also copied to the clipboard. That's always going to happen by default in this automation. All right, and so once this ends, we're going to return control back to form defaults. Then we return control back to display input form. And then once we're back here, remember, the entire time we're passing back and forth our config dictionary. And what we're going to do now is we're going to assign our config dictionary, which has been totally updated by our processes, back to the object container, and then it's going to be reinserted back into our form. So that's how you're able to update your form in real time with fresh new values that have been modified by your process. All right, and that's what would happen if your buttons were clicks instead of submit buttons. All right, last but not least, we just provide this sequence here. So sometimes a user might exit the form by pressing the X in the upper left right-hand corner of the form instead of, let's say, pressing cancel or submit. If they do that, we make sure to catch that gracefully and set the form as canceled as well. So once we're finished here, we're going to return control back out into the bottom of this. Okay, and then depending on if it's successful, exception occurred, system exception occurred, we're going to go to a result form. In the result form, we basically determine what kind of form we need to display to the end user based upon where where we came from to the result form. So there's this origin and status string, and you'll see that that's being referenced or set through each of these transitions. Okay, so you can see here, origin and status, process, business exception. So based upon the transition to result form, we set that origin and status variable. And then from there, we just invoke the appropriate result form. So there's a result form for errors and there's a result form for success. All right. So let me take a look at the error result form. You can see here, this is another form that we display separately from the previous form. And in here, you actually don't need to modify these at all. These are already taken care of for you. So you can see we have a email error button, repeat process, close. And based upon what you select, we're going to go ahead and execute one of these, right? So here is an email error. We're basically invoking and sending a mail to URL string so that you can open your default email client with that message populated. And if you repeat the process, we're basically setting this repeat process flag to true. And you'll see back in the main workflow that in the transition, we do check, does that repeat process, is this true, right? If it is, we're going to go back. And so that's how we determine whether or not we should loop back to the user input form and process. So those are all the errors. You'll see that we do rethrow the error after the result form is done. The reason why we do that is because we want to make sure that that error is logged in the orchestrator. If we catch everything, everything will look like a successful execution. If we rethrow the error, then we can actually log the errors that occur. All right, and so you can see down here, if the origin and status to the result form was processed in success, meaning that I had a successful execution, then what we're going to do is we're going to go in here, we're going to check, was this first run? If it was, we're going to set it to true now. Or we're going to set it to false now, sorry. And that would allow us to hide the form during the next execution. And then here, if you wanted to just reset any certain field keys, let's say passwords or other things that you don't want saved locally, you can just set them to blank strings here. Last but not least, because this is a successful execution, we're going to overwrite that local config file. So remember, locally it is stored in this master config automation folder runconfig.txt. This runconfig.txt is what's being overwritten right here with our most updated config dictionary. All right, and then basically we check to see has the end user selected to hide the results form. If they didn't, we're going to show this success form. All right, in the success form, the user has the ability to view outputs, right? If the automation generated some outputs to its local folder, there's a repeat process button and there's a close button. This view output button is a little tricky. So we had to determine how could we show this button, and if the user clicked the button, what folder path would it open to? And we had to make it a little bit more rigid than we wanted to. But basically what's happening is we're going to open the folder file explorer, and if you have a field key in your dictionary or in your user input form with the field key output folder path, then it will open up to that folder path. Okay. Now this view outputs button will only appear if show view output in your config dictionary is set to true. Now by default it is set to false. You're going to need to set it to true in your process .xaml. And so you can actually see in my process, I actually do set that to true when the user selects to save the file locally. So you can see here, I'm checking, hey, has the user checked that save file locally box? If so, we're going to go through, we're going to save that file to that output folder they selected. And then I'm going to set this show view output field key to true, and then that's going to enable or display that view output button in my result form success. All right. So once that's done, the user can press close. They can repeat the process. If they repeat it, it'll go back through, redisplay the form. If they close it, we will continue to end the process. And basically what's happening here is we're broadcasting a message, okay, to that status window, and the message is going to be end process. End process with no spaces, capital E, capital P, is a special message that we've designated that will actually break that loop and allow you to end the automation. If you don't do this, your automation will never end, because basically, even though your main workflow has finished, the status window is going to continue listening forever. And so what we do is we broadcast a message. It's a special message called end process, as you can see here, and it's going to break out of that loop. And so that's why we have that broadcast message here, end process. Sometimes it doesn't catch it on the first attempt, and so that's why we have two here, just in case. Okay. Last but not least, we have the option to hide the user inputs form at runtime. If that happens, everything occurs the same way that I just discussed. The config dictionary is initialized with the local run config.txt file. So you're going to use your input selections from the previous execution. And then we're going to travel down here. And at this point, if it's not the first run on the version and the user has selected hide input forms in the assistant, we're going to go down this left column rather than the right column. So the form doesn't get shown. We jump directly into form actions button, and we're going to execute the process that's associated with the last button the user clicked in the form. So if you have multiple buttons and the last thing the user clicked was get emails, it's going to run get emails, unfortunately. So just be careful with this. Sometimes it's more likely to be used for, let's say, forms that have one button, but it's really helpful when people, let's say, don't have parameters that are going to change from execution to execution. Last but not least, I have included everything that you need to modify in just these 4 XAMLs right here. So the main, honestly, you actually don't need to modify it. I just left it here so that you would have something to reference. The form button action, as I mentioned, you're going to have to create cases for each button if you have more than one in your form, and then the appropriate workflow to execute. The display form input, all you need to do is open up this form and bring in your input components so that it would display appropriate to the end user. You don't need to modify anything else. And then just slot in your process that you're going to execute. All the automations or all the workflows are utilizing the config dictionary to pass all the values back and forth. It was just easier and a lot more efficient to know that that's the one thing that you're going to utilize. You don't have to keep track of different variables that may or may not be null. And here's the framework workflows. So these are things that are used by the automation, but you don't need to touch. So if you want to understand what's happening or if there's an error that occurs, they're here for you, but you don't need to modify them. And then, of course, here's the RU framework workflows. So these aren't actually invoked at all throughout the automation. I left them here for your own reference. As you can see, almost everything is the same as the RU framework. The only thing different is this. Yeah, there is nothing different. They're all the same. And if you want to see how this works using Take a Screenshot, all you need to do is go into Form Button Action, change this to the Process Overview workflow, and then you'll actually see the same exact automation being performed by you via using the RU framework with the linear process, right? The entry point for your RU framework, once again, is Process Overview, and the exit point is going to be close all applications or kill all processes. All right. So that is the Attended Framework in a nutshell. It was a lot. I know this was a long session. I really appreciate your patience and moving and going along with me. I'm really excited to see how everyone utilizes the Attended Framework, the use cases that you use, and all the rich experiences you provide for your end users. If you have any questions, once again, my name is Tuan Nguyen. I'm a product manager at UiPath. This is the Attended Framework 2.0, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.